it was really an interesting opportunity. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the video so we can start the presentation and share my screen. Hopefully everyone is able to see a beautiful pink background. Is that coming through, John?
Sorry, muted myself. Yep, looks good.
All right. So, as always.
Hey, wait, really quick.
Okay.
I don't know
okay,
what happens with everybody else, but if you guys are seeing a very, very big version of Kelby's screen, at the top of your screen, there's a green bar that says you're viewing Kelby Shelton's screen, and then next to that is a view options. Click that view options and hit fit to window, and that might give you a better rendering if you're struggling with that. That happens to me every time.
Thank you for that tip, Jeff. Appreciate it. So let's get started with this presentation. This is a nice little disclaimer about what this talk is and is not, so you all can read that. I wanted to talk about what this talk is, what our agenda is, and maybe kind of discuss where you can get some other resources. So what this talk is about is discussing the risk-based approach that you may or may not have heard about already, distilling it into the core concepts so that the barrier to entry for everyone is as little as possible. So this will not be a technical deep dive. There are many presentations, and I reference them at the end. I'll give you guys the resources. There's tons of resources out there if you would like a technical assistance. I am planning on giving some tips and tricks and things that I experienced along the way on this journey at Children's Mercy, so that maybe you guys can come away with this presentation as a clearer understanding of risk-based alerting, along with a few ideas on where to go from here. So that being said, our 5 topics are defining why we need a new solution, what that perfect solution might look like, how you would implement that solution in a practical and technical aspect, what other customers have seen with this approach, and then what are your next steps after this presentation? How do you begin this adoption if you like the things we discussed today? So, defining the problem. What does the average Security Operations Center, or SOC, learning strategy look like as it relates to enterprise security, and what challenges are SOCs confronted with, and what are they left with at the end of the day? So, first of all, our typical enterprise security strategy might look something like this. We have a few correlation searches turned on. I only showed 3 here for clarity, but this might be 15, this might be 50, this might be 100. They're all designed to be the perfect alert so that you can have as little noise as possible. But what ends up happening is we get a incident review page that looks something like this, where we have hundreds of notables and they're all lined up, stacked on top of each other, and you don't know where to go. Well, how did we get there? Well, between turning on those correlation searches and this incident review page, we onboarded new data sets. We turned on a couple new correlation searches. We did all of this with minimal staffing, and now we're left with a list of alerts that we're never going to get to. And we're never going to be able to tune all of this. It would require a monumental workforce to handle it all. So that's one part of the problem. The next part of the problem is you have to think about a holistic security approach. We are constantly inundated with next-gen firewalls, network detection and response, endpoint products, various vendor-specific alerts, think Azure, AWS. Do we ignore those? How do we fold those in to a unified alerting strategy? Because we don't want visibility gaps. But at the end of the day, this is where we're at. We have manual correlation for our analysts. We have huge gaps because there's no way to look at every alert. And we need a huge army of analysts and engineers to handle this beast. So what is the better solution, and can we make that happen using the tools at hand? So let's imagine what that solution might look like. What if we could have an alert that has built-in correlation, is scalable with our workforce, whether we have a handful of analysts or we have an entire SOC. We don't have to spend a ton of time tuning it. And it is mapped to an industry standard framework, so we can prove that we are getting better or we are detecting more things. We can report on that. Each alert is coupled together with improved fidelity and requires less investigation time. And when new threats emerge, we can deploy new use cases faster. That sounds like a pretty good solution to me. So let's describe how we get there, how we approach it, and what the process might look like. So from a very high level overview, we need a new enriched linked together data set. How do we get that? Well, first of all, we don't ignore anything. Turn it all on. Every alert you can think of, we want that data because Splunk is all about big data. So let's pull all that together, and in the middle, the correlation searches, let that be the vehicle to string all these data sets together and ultimately dump it into a common bucket. Once we've done that, we pull from the common bucket to get a new kind of notable. This is a notable that has raw logs, vendor security alerts, endpoint alerts, all of it stitched together, ready to go for the analyst. So boiled down to its key components, the way we get there is a 4-step process. We align our searches to an industry standard framework, in this case MITRE. We attribute and score risk based on the assets and identities that are important to our enterprise. We put that in a common location, the risk index, and then we alert on those anomalies. So before I move into the next section, I do want to see if anyone has any questions so far about what we've discussed. I'm trying to.
Doesn't look like there's
anything in the.
Kelby?
I'm sorry.
Nothing in the chat yet.
Nothing in the chat. Okay. All right. Perfect. Again, just a reminder, just post in the chat. John will let me know if we have any questions. So risk-based alerting, what does that look like from a technical perspective, moving through the steps? So step 1, aligning our search to MITRE. For this presentation, I picked a very basic search, excessive failed logouts. This is how it exists in a default enterprise security deployment. Only 3 lines of Splunk query language, and all it's doing is determining any failed authentication attempts by source and the application used where it is greater than 6 failures. How do we align that to MITRE? Well, the first thing you want to do is do your research. This is a screenshot from the MITRE tactic for brute force, which most closely aligns with the failed authentication. When we start doing our research, we discover other tactics and techniques that we might be interested in. credential dumping, passing the hash, password spraying. We might also uncover more specific software or more specific techniques that we might not have considered beyond just security concepts, like failed authentications are bad. You actually uncover what are real advanced persistent threats doing. What are the methods they're using? So that's what we want to do. We want to be as specific as possible and align ourselves to something we can report on later. So what is this magical process of aligning ourselves to MITRE? Well, it's pretty simple. It's a simple eval statement. We stack that on top of our search. We use the MITRE ID number. We can append multiple, as you see from the slide. And later on, we can use lookups to translate those IDs to friendly names of the tactics and techniques. So that's step one. Step two, we want to attribute a risk to an asset or identity in our environment. Now that by default, the risk framework inside of enterprise security supports a type of system, user, or other. For the majority of our use cases, we're going to use system or user, and that is the asset or identity we're talking about. Now I've shown two methods of adding this to our search. One is a simple eval where we use define the risk object as the source of the authentication failures. If, for instance, we had wanted to define another one, we can use the append pipe command and add in a user. Additionally, we want to add some sort of friendly message for the analyst later on. In this instance, I've used string concatenation to basically say there have been X number of authentication failures from X number of unique users originating from some source. And that helps the analyst out, as you will see later in our live demo, makes it much friendlier to read. Lastly, we want to score that data. Now, I've listed two methods, static and dynamic. For getting started quickly, a static risk score would be the quickest method to adoption. That's going to be a best guess and best judgment based on your experience, and we can tweak it later. So don't worry about getting it perfect. I recommend a score between 0 and 100 for each of my alerts and work from there. If it's too noisy, we score it down. If it's not noisy enough, if it's not producing the alerts we want, we crank it up. Pretty simple as far as tuning goes. Not have to worry about complicated whitelists. The dynamic option is something I highly encourage everyone work towards as they adopt this system, because you're going to incorporate that score along with a modifier for the object's priority. Ultimately, as you build out your assets and identities within enterprise security, you can rank their criticality. So from a scale of 0 being unknown and 4 being critical, you can determine that if Jane Doe or John Smith triggered an alert, well, Jane Doe is a desktop admin, so she has a lot of rights, and I might want to crank up the risk, but John Smith is a person in marketing, so they don't have as much access. There's also more advanced scoring that I will make available to you guys as resources for this slide deck, where you can use concepts such as friendly names, such as impact, if this were true, confidence level, etc. But for the purpose of easy adoption, just think about adopting a dynamic risk score if you can, if you've got a nicely built out asset and identity system. So we've got our correlation search mapped to MITRE. We've attributed the risk. The next thing we want to do is collect it. So for each of our correlation searches, I've given 3 options. They each have their pros and cons. The first method being the collect statement. That's the simplest and easy to understand method. That's personally the one I would use. The severe caveat to that, though, is there is no throttling for this method, which means your searches are going to need the snap to feature of Splunk. So you will want your searches to not overlap. Now, this might be scary at first because you might think you might have visibility gaps. But what we're talking about is onboarding 10, 50, 100, 150 alerts. So if those are all running every 60 minutes, looking back at the previous 60 minutes, there will be no visibility gaps just for the sheer volume of alerting you have and visibility in your environment. The middle column is similar, send alert risk, invoking the send alert command in Splunk, same caveats. The last column might be a better fit for those looking to adopt this system quickly. And that's just basically setting up a blank risk analysis adaptive response action. What this allows you to do is tack it on to your existing correlation searches, and it supports throttling. You don't have to specify any fields in here. Just leave it blank or leave it whatever Splunk says is a required field. Because you are evaling those fields in your alert, that will take precedence over anything you put in here. So it will throttle. It has been tested. We did this at Children's Mercy. It will throttle if you use that method, and it supports multiple risk objects. Lastly, we have our finished alert. This is what it looks like. Pretty simple. We are evaling a risk object and risk object type. We are adding a friendly message, and we are sending the alert with a parameter of 50. Something I chose off the top of my head, that's in the medium range. As I get a better feel of how noisy this alert's going to be, I will lower it or raise it as needed. So assuming we've done the work of getting all this data into this risk index, we don't have any notables at this point. How do we get those notables for our analysts to look at? Well, I've shown here on the left a sample risk index queue of things you might see, which is a name attached to the risk rule or detection search that ran, attached with a score, and not shown here is the tactic. Obviously, the MITRE ID would be there as well. So we can do a simple aggregation. I've shown a sample one here. Risk notable greater than 100 within 24 hours. So if we do that, we will be left with anomalies. So we've turned this noisy list of items into 3 notables. On the left, we have Jane Smith received a suspicious email, some PowerShell executed, and then there was some command and control traffic. She got a 110. Workstation 1 is important to us. It only had 2 risk rules, but it still bubbled up to be a notable. And lastly, we have a domain controller. It only had 1 detection search against it, but because it's so important to us, we've made sure that it is scored a high enough risk that it will always alert. Now, risk score of greater than 100 is just one method. I've mentioned MITRE over and over again. Using MITRE tactics is absolutely an excellent method of uncovering anomalies, things that are spanning multiple MITRE tactics. Objects that have risk objects that have multiple sources of risk, multiple detections against them. Risk objects that haven't scored highly, but because they've had consistent amount of detections over a longer period of time, think low and slow attacks. That's another aggregation. So with this risk system, you can easily look back 3 days, 7 days, 30 days, and uncover anomalies that way as well. So before I move on to the last section, or the last piece of this section, which is our live demo, does anyone have any questions for me?
Okay, so we've got Justin asked a question. He says, I've done before is add a risk score of 0 on the dynamic risk score because you may not want to alert on it, but if some other rules hit and an object gets a high score, you will still see the interesting event that had a score of 0.
Is that a suggestion? It sounded like more of a...
It's more of a statement of something that he's...
Okay, yeah, absolutely. If you want to try out how it will look in the risk index without actually populating with scores, that's another method. Later on in the presentation, I'll go over timelines and how we get to our first notable. So I'll provide some recommendations on scoring risk, and ultimately, you don't want to leave stuff blank for too long. You want to keep it noisy. You want a new risk framework, a populated risk framework, populated risk index that you can play around with. And I'll walk you through that. But yeah, great suggestion. Is that all we had so far, John?
Yep, that's it.
Okay, so this demo is based on the Boss of the SOC V2 dataset. I believe there's another one in the works for the V3 dataset to keep it modern and up to date. But we're going to look at 2 scenarios. The first being a single device with a piece of malware on it. The second being a more advanced threat that requires some pivoting and some additional triage. So we'll show you both of these situations and apply the functions we know about enterprise security and how we can investigate with this new type of system. So let me pull that up. And can you still all see my screen with Splunk Enterprise?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So we'll go into the Enterprise Security app. And we'll click on our friendly incident review page that you've probably seen many times. And we'll go ahead and pull up some RBA alerts. Okay, so we have 12 notables sorted by time. And we're going to look at the first scenario for a piece of malware on a single device in the lens of this user, Cute Kitten. Now, as I scroll down, I want to point out a couple features of a risk notable that it might be different than what you're used to. One being built-in prioritization. So we have a score. If you're confronted with a notable with a score of 1200 versus 500, you know which one to go for first. You can quantify your threats. Additionally, you will see multiple risk messages. This is not just one-off notable. These are all individual things that on their own could have been a notable in of themselves. But put together, they tell a different story. Each one of these could have been ignored. USB insertion, first time seen. I don't care. Some dynamic DNS activity, it's probably nothing. But now we have all of these put together. This system is screaming at us, telling us that this is a absolute priority, go investigate. So how do we investigate? We examine the risk attributions for this system, and we know it's a system because we have our risk object type system. And here's where the tactics and techniques come into play. We've got all of our friendly names of techniques, and analysts can easily explain what's going on based off industry standard terms. And when it comes to investigation, we've got all of our rules that bubbled up to this being a notable, along with related risk objects where cute kitten might have appeared, but might not have been the source of the threat. So, or been directly the risk object that we scored on. And that kind of allows, think pivoting, that allows some pivot behavior. And at the bottom, we have this nice panel, all the risk messages associated with this system lined up on top of each other. And it doesn't take a ton of investigation to piece together this story. We have a USB device plugged into the system for the first time, some suspicious processes executing, a backdoor showing up, along with some command and control activity, and then some dynamic DNS. It's pretty clear this user plugged in a USB drive with some malware on it. I didn't have to run any Splunk queries to determine that. This is all just information that is being dumped into our risk index. All these interesting security events that on their own might be ignored. Let's look at the other situation. Scenario 2, a more advanced threat. And we'll look at that in the lens of a user, Billy Tunn. So let's see what's going on with Billy. And we do that similar method, but in this case, we're going to select risk object type of user. So we're going to examine the risk attributions for that user. And what's nice about having your enterprise security assets and identities filled out, especially with Enterprise Security 6, as we discussed in our last user group meeting, you can add custom fields. So for example, this identity, you could see all the group membership he's a part of by adding that and populating that if you have your LDAP built out or whatever system you're using to populate your identities. So just taking a cursory glance at this user, I see account manipulation, PowerShell, a spear phishing attachment. This looks pretty bad. Looks like this user might have gotten phished along with some PowerShell. I'm curious what that PowerShell is. And looking down, again, running no SPL, we can see the individual risk attribution that we've carried forward. And we can find that PowerShell right here. So we've got some encoded PowerShell. Doesn't look good. I don't like seeing encoded PowerShell right after a phishing attachment. So I'm going to see what's going on with this user system. If we look at the related system risk objects, we have that this user has appeared in connection with this system. So I can quickly pivot on this system to find out everything going on with it. It's also got a pretty high score and has been seen with similar activity, PowerShell, user execution, some account manipulation. This could be a continuation of the threat. Now you'll see source system and desk system. This is the iteration of this RBA application, and I'll go into that at the end. But I wanted to point out that in newer iterations, we have this concept of threat object. And it's something we did at Children's Mercy that has kind of influenced the community and allows for IOC hunting and generation of threat intel about yourself by specifying a threat object within every alert. So I won't go into too much about that in this presentation, but just be aware of the concept. So in this case, we want to pivot on our risk score for a asset in our identity, but we're going to change the lens on a IOC instead, using the same information. It's just a different aggregation. So we have a suspicious SSL certificate. We want to see who's been interacting with this SSL certificate that we don't recognize. And ultimately, we've discovered a few other machines that have also been interacting that could all be related to this threat and that we might need to take action because there could be some lateral movement. So that's RBA as it exists with enterprise security. Now, if you saw the presentation summary that went out, you'll notice I wanted to include something about Phantom because I love Phantom. I love playing around with it, playbooking. I wanted to show you how we've incorporated Phantom within our RBA workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to Phantom. And I've basically ingested those same notables into Phantom for the purpose of doing my case management and my triage inside of Phantom. And pulling back just to the ones we already explored, Cute Kitten, we can see how that might look inside of case management. If you guys have seen Mission Control at .conf last year, this interface might be very familiar, and it's a direction that the product line appears to be going. And so I would get used to this interface, but I personally like it because I've got my HUD right here, ready to go, telling me that this is the risk object, this is the score. I've got my data card built out, and this is all done through normal playbooking, no fancy coding right here. So I can pivot on this data point and go back to the dashboard within ES if I prefer that view. But if I wanted to stay in here, I could assign this to myself, start working it, and see all the artifacts from that original Splunk notable, which is right here, populated inside of Phantom. So we have our USB insertion along with the serial numbers. We have our threat intel match, the domains that were seen with that threat intel, and we have our intrusion detection event, that backdoor Trojan. And we can even do the pivot that we discussed later, but we'll do it the Phantom way instead of the Splunk way. Even though that was nice that we could just click through a couple dashboards and pivot on this behavior and uncover different activity, it'd be nice if that was already waiting for us and just to save even more time. So in this situation, I'm going to run a playbook across all these events, and we'll call it risk pivot is the one I've created. And essentially, it does the work for us. It runs those search events. And so let's click into that system we know had some related activity, the Billy Tunn. We see our pivot is running. And even though I've kicked this off, I just want to point out again that this could be ready and waiting for you for your analyst. And this is a probably an underspec'd machine here. So if there's any sluggishness, I'll own up to that. So here's the query made into Splunk with all the related events put in a table. You could present this as a table through playbooking, and the guys at Children's Mercy will attest to this as well. We've done it through comments in the event. We've done it through notes. There's many different ways to present this data, however your analysts like to consume it, so that they don't have to do a bunch of busy work. So I've got a list of machines here that I've, through my research and through my investigation within Phantom, I've determined are all items that I might want to take action on. So I've done the liberty of putting together a list of machines that I want to take action on. So I'm just copying that over from my notepad. That could also be stored in here as an artifact. That's something I would be remiss if I didn't mention, is that this is all data in your case management system already. So you don't have to document it again. And an analyst can leave notes and say, hey, I found these machines, and put that in there. They can also put in notes this way. And format it however you like. Make it a little bit friendlier and leave notes that way. But let's actually take action on this instead of just researching it. So I'm going to fire up a playbook called Quarantine Devices. I'm going to kick that off. It's going to prompt me to provide a comma-separated list of host names to quarantine. Well, I've got that already. Throw that in there. Now, this could be artifacts within the investigation. This could be a CSV that you've thrown in the vault. This is not intended to be a Phantom deep dive, so there's a lot of features not covered here, but just know that there's lots of different ways to prompt your analyst for this information. In this case, I've done a manual prompt with just a string with comma-separated values. I'm going to complete that and start quarantining these devices. So that situation is taken care of. That frees me up to kick off any other workflows or playbooks or actions to begin the remediation of this. ServiceNow or ticketing systems to collect those machines for further investigation, or what have you, could all be playbooked and automated and sent out. So that's a little bit about how you can do risk-based alerting inside of Phantom as well. So that's the end of the live demo. Does anyone have any questions along that?
Again, nothing in chat.
Okay. You said there was nothing in chat, or?
Nope.
Okay. Okay. Quiet today. I hope that means I'm doing a good job of explaining this. So moving back to our slide deck, let me present again. All right, perfect. So what have other people experienced with this RBA approach? These are some quotes you'll probably see in some of the other presentations if you follow this. A gentleman by the name of Jimmy at Texas Instruments gave a wonderful presentation at last year's .conf on what they did with RBA. This is a quote from another member of Texas Instruments, that this is basically changed the way they operate and allowed them to focus on the most impactful events. Stuart McIntosh, formerly with another company, now works for Outpost Security. He was an early contributor to the RBA group and is a constantly involved in the Slack channel for RBA and continues to contribute to the community. They achieved a 60% true positive rate in the SOC within less than a year, which is pretty incredible if you've ever been inundated with and actually done your metrics on the number of alerts that you've gotten. And Children's Mercy, as I've mentioned, I used to be there. When we deployed this system, we were at a 7% true positive rate. We managed to boost that up to 33% pretty quickly after also onboarding 29 new correlation searches. And the last statistics I took, we were hovering around a 30 to 50% true positive rate. And again, that's with a very small security team. And they had an MSSP, and so operations were very lean, but we were still able to scale. And not mentioned here is deploy a new endpoint products. You know how noisy endpoint products can be. We deployed it, kept everything going. Analysts weren't overwhelmed, and it was made much easier by having RBA in place. So ultimately, if we want to adapt this new mentality of alerting, how do we get there? Well, you're not alone. There are plenty of resources out there, including some excellent .conf talks, as well as a SANS presentation by a Splunk architect by the name of Jim Apker at SANS. There's also the RBA app, which you may have seen in the demo, called SA RBA. This contains a lot of the macros, lookups, dashboards, all that stuff that you need to get started, ready to go. And you just throw it on Splunk, and it's constantly updated, constantly improved. So definitely follow that. I also highly encourage everyone to set up a home dashboard. This is a very simple one that I threw together. XML is at the final slides, but basically keep an eye on your risk system. And you don't have to have your notable in place. You don't have to have a bunch of risk rules turned on. Just keep it at the foremost of your day-to-day operations. That helped me the most, especially as a one-person army for this system at first. By having this, logging into it every day before we even adopted RBA, I was able to keep track of what I needed to do and how the system, how I might interact with the system once it was in production. And as a member of the security incident response team, Carter, I believe he's on the call, this has been a huge boost to him for threat hunting, even after we switched RBA, because you can look at all the items that didn't bubble up to 100 risk score or X number of MITRE tactics. And you can pull those out using different aggregation techniques. And those could be new candidates for not only investigation, but also tuning. And maybe you need to crank up the risk score because they uncovered something interesting. So this can be used even after you adopt RBA. So here's a timeline based roughly on what we experienced at Children's Mercy. Now, this might be less or more, depending on the size of your SOC and how much you want to go down this road. And I highly encourage everyone to do your research and think about doing this, because I've worked in a SOC, I've seen the noise, and this system works time and time again. So what does that timeline look like? So at 1 to 2 weeks, your first risk rule should be turned on. And what does that mean? That means you've added MITRE, you've added your risk attribution, you're collecting risk, but that still is going to your notable queue. So take one or more of your existing correlation searches that are still going to that notable queue, tack on risk information, and having go in the background. Now, you'll want to make sure that nothing else is corrupting that data. So if you had any other risk attribution or using that risk framework, make sure you're starting over fresh, and that any of that old data ages out. Or if you really want to start over fresh, you can, of course, manually delete that data out of the index. Your next milestone is going to be that home dashboard. You've got enough risk rules turned on that you can play with the scores. You can see what it might look like if you did create a notable, and you just kind of live there for a month or two. And then one of the most satisfying things is when you have that first risk notable and you start learning how to triage it, because you got to think about, analysts aren't used to having to piece together the picture for themselves in this way. They're used to following maybe a workflow, depending on how your SOC is structured, a process. This is kind of having to use some abstract thinking to triage these. So once you get that first risk notable, you're going to continue to convert the other risk rules. You're going to learn how that should be triaged. You're going to train up your SOC and make sure all the dashboards that they might use to investigate these are working, so that when they do adopt this and they do, you flip the switch, they're not lost. And then after 6 months or so, you run full RBA, which means you've got all your existing correlation searches, which if you have a bunch already, this might take you longer. At Children's Mercy, we didn't have that many at the beginning, so this was quicker. You've got your SOC trained, and you've got a tuning dashboard, tuning process set up. So the latest, I just heard today, the latest iteration of the SA-RBA has a tuning dashboard in it, which helps keep track of your risk rules. And I haven't played with it, but I've seen some screenshots, and that would have been hugely helpful for me at Children's Mercy. So take a look at that. And then ultimately do some red teaming. See where your gaps are, see if your risk system is working as expected. Red teaming is really great, because if there wasn't a risk rule that was in the risk index, then that's a MITRE attack gap that you need to onboard. If the logs didn't exist at all, there's a new data source that you should onboard. So it really helps shore up your gaps. And I mentioned Jimmy earlier at Texas Instruments. They're doing some crazy things around catching pen testers with this system, and it's incredible. He has a lot of good stories to tell about that. I wanted to give, this kind of brings us to the end. I wanted to give a shout out to everyone at Children's Mercy, the cybersecurity incident response team. Ultimately, without their help, their spirit of innovation at Children's Mercy, wanting to do the best thing possible for the safety and security of the children there, I wouldn't have been able to deploy these systems. They absolutely believed in me, from the CISO all the way down to the analyst, and they gave me encouragement. And I really wanted to thank them in this, and appreciate everything they did for me. So that brings us to the end.
All right. Jeremy asked, did you also use UBA product there?
We did not. We had a UBA product, but it wasn't folded in yet. So a lot of these techniques are synonymous or go lockstep with UBA products or machine learning or any of the other kind of security strategies, because ultimately what you want to alert on are any anomalies. So you could definitely fold in a UBA product with this.
Justin had a comment. He said he used to work at TI with Jimmy Mills. I said, I'll concur that those statements are correct. This framework has worked greatly. My suggestion is to get a few working. Make sure you tune your risk score metrics. I agree with that.
Yeah, excellent, Justin. Thank you for that comment. That risk scoring matrix he's talking about is, I'll show you in the appendix here. When you start including things like impact and confidence, it allows you to fine tune some things. You have some additional variables. You have a more complicated risk score, which was this slide, I believe, here. You have some additional scoring factors, and that's just taking it to another level. So that introduces some complexity, and it's not, by no means is it required. But at the very least, please, if you guys haven't had your assets and identities system looked at, or make sure it has information, you're going to want to make sure the priorities and stuff are in there, because when you start using this system, this risk framework inside of enterprise security, at least for us, it uncovered that our assets were not in a great shape. Identities needed to be cleaned up, and ultimately it left us going down this route. It made investigations easier. You could find the information you're looking for because we were forced to do that cleanup work. And it exposes frameworks and abilities of ES that, as a longtime user of ES, I had either forgotten about or just wasn't fully explained on how to use. And I suddenly, because I had a necessity to use them with this key component of the risk framework, sorry, there was getting some feedback there. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So because this RBA system was at the foremost, all those other frameworks and abilities of ES, we started using them again, and swim lane investigators and things like that. So you'll suddenly be like, oh, this is why I bought the product. This is why I use this. So it's very cool.
Hey, Kelby, this is Jeff. I have a question.
Sure.
Don't necessarily myself have security background. So, maybe this is just a question that's unique to me not having that background, or maybe other people feel this way. But one of the things that I've observed when I've worked with, certain or really many customers from a security perspective is that there's some of the current behavior around reacting to an alert or a notable event is, I guess, maybe like tactical. Like a really good example would be, I have a malware alert for a device. Well, my tactical response for that is going to basically be to validate that malware is in fact bad, and then go and request that the device be wiped. And that's it. I've worked that issue. So I guess my question is do those sorts of tactical actions still need to occur? Is there I guess I want to better understand, like, how does your mindset change, and how do you kind of continue to work with the with some of those basic tactical things that either need to continue to be done or they don't need to be done, and here's why.
Yeah, malware is a good example of that. So malware alerts can fall into multiple categories, things that have already been cleaned up and you might not generate a notable on. With the risk system, you dump all that information. You want to know that there was a piece of malware, regardless of what it is, found on a system and it was cleaned up, but you score a low risk. When you have items that might need cleaned up because there was malware discovered and it hasn't been handled, that absolutely still exists in this system, and you can handle that a few different ways. So the way we handled it at Children's Mercy is we scored a high amount of risk on that item so that it would always surface, and the analyst always knew what to do with that item. So they were very easy to triage. Once we had a workflow established for those items that was repeatable and could be fleshed out in a linear way with Phantom, we would automate that item. And then now it falls into the category of a threat that was not cleaned initially by the AV product, but it has a reduced amount of risk because automation is going to come by within minutes and kick off any workflows that are needed to clean that item up. So it's kind of a step through process. You start out with always scoring 100+ points of risk on that item, so you always see it. And then you kind of, once you trust that your automation is working the way it's intended to work and it's being handled, you start turning down the risk because you don't need to know about that item unless it's accompanied with something else, like a PowerShell that was executed. Well, now we have a different story because not only was that item detected, but it then executed. So now we have a new kind of triage that needs to occur. And I hope does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, so you're saying that, for the things in the environment that that do require action, and you know those things, today, make sure that you've configured the system that those are going to produce risk scores that bubble up and that action can be taken. But if it's not necessarily going to require action, then obviously it's going to get a lower risk score, which is only going to get bubbled up to you when that thing comes in conjunction with several other things. And then when you have that type of a risk alert, it sounds like you're really changing your mindset, not towards that tactical cleaning that item up, but now looking at that situation more holistically and trying to piece together the whole story of what happened, and what you need to do about it.
Yeah, by having the more risk rules you can turn on and dump into that system, when they do bubble up, you're not just doing a one-off alert that you caught and then you're like, oh, I'm done there, wipe my hands. You've got the whole picture. So you can say, I've traced down every component of this that I could possibly have traced down, and I have contained the threat, and I know about the threat, and there's not any sort of lateral movement or anything that's going on that I might have missed. I did just look at the time. I wanted to be respectful of everyone's time. Was this an hour user groups meeting?
Yeah, I mean, with it being virtual, it's definitely not as big a deal as like when we're in person, because I mean, people can leave as they need to, but
right,
being the virtual, there's no real time restriction.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to thank everyone who's still on the call for attending and for inviting me to speak, John and Jeff. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, we really appreciate you coming out. It was a good topic. And I agree with Jeff. I think being able to, with the risk-based approach, you see more of the holistic story. You're seeing everything that's there versus, I mean, when I worked in the SOC, I mean, that was one of the things. It wasn't just, oh, there was malware on the machine. It was, okay, now we got to figure out how did that malware get there? What were the steps that, where did this come from? What happened prior to this? What happened since? Even if it was clean, there's a lot of information you had to gather to make sure that there wasn't any other compromise done, and that gave us IOCs to search for other systems. And having that ability to have that already there, or at least a great deal of it there, just by looking at what the other risk scores, what generated the other risk scores, is very valuable.
I would definitely agree.
Anybody else got any questions for Kelby? or for Jeff and I. I've had a couple people reach out to me about information about the Slack channel, so I'll be sending out sending anybody that asked, I'll send that information to you this afternoon about signing up for it. And if you got any other questions, Kelby, can you send me your slide deck? Is that up?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll get that to you.
So I'll send that out to the group, and I'll see what I can do about getting the recording posted and send that out too. So we'll have some more information. Just remember, Monday we have the work from home meeting, and then next month Jeff will be presenting, and I'll be sending that information out too. So anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, really appreciate everybody coming out and taking the time out of your day to join us. And please let me know if you have any questions or anything you need. Well, me and Jeff will be happy to help. Thank you, Kelby, for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.
All right. Everybody have a good day.